Hi 8th grade. This video will cover the force lab. We've talked about this a bunch in class and we've already written the force lab draft number 1 and 2. But this will be some good review for your midterm as you're studying and just to kind of make sure that you've got that story all in order. So the purpose of the Rubberband Lab, the force lab. First and foremost, as with most of our labs, it's data analysis and graphing. So can we take a look at those graphs? Can we identify what the pattern is, meaning what the curve is? And can we analyze the data, meaning compare the numbers and see how one rubber band is different than another? Another part of it is getting practice with writing a coherent story. So that's this part right here of the forces at work in the lab through the use of science vocabulary and references to the data. So whenever you're writing a lab report, you not only want it to be coherent so that it makes sense and it flows and it proves your argument, you want to use relatively sophisticated vocabulary so that it at least sounds like you know what you're talking about, using the vocab that we've talked about in class. Also, it should reference the data. So if you're talking about how much the thin rubber band stretched versus the thick rubber band, and that the thin rubber band had to stretch more, it would be important to call in some of those numbers from our data table. So you could talk about how the thin rubber band stretched 10 centimeters for the first 3 bolts, and the thick rubber band only stretched 2 centimeters. And if you could refer back to the data and specific data points, that's going to make your argument all the more strong. So this video is going to focus pretty much just on that coherent story. So the vocab that should have been in that story is right over here. So unbalanced forces, meaning both balanced, and that's spelled incorrectly, nice, balanced and unbalanced forces, net force, mass, force of gravity, which is the same thing as weight, force of the rubber band, equilibrium, normal force. All of those terms in some way should hopefully end up in your story. So, in the story, we're using that as a fill-in for kind of the essay for the discussion section for that force and acceleration part of the lab. So my suggestion from the beginning was draw a sketch, right? Sketch it out because that will help you see where the different forces are. So you know that I am not an artist, but here is, the 3 stages of my sketch. So in stage 1 over here, we've got the ring stand right here. Goes over here would be the clamp. You've got the rubber band and the bag hanging from it. Then I just took some notes next to it. It's balanced. The net force is 0, which means they're at equilibrium. We could even also add in something like no mass in bag, right? There's nothing in there yet. So in stage number 2, we've got mass in the bag, right? Those are the bolts in the bag. So mass means an increase in the force of gravity, meaning an increase of the weight, meaning that's unbalanced. And this causes the rubber band to stretch to apply a greater force. And I wrote x 25, meaning times 25. This is going to happen 25 more times. That the mass is going to increase, the force of gravity is going to increase, they're going to become unbalanced, the bag is going to move downwards, right? Then the rubber band is going to stretch to apply greater force. That's going to happen again and again and again until, in stage 3, the rubber band breaks. When that happens, as you can see, here's my rubber band with the little broken section right over here. The bag is going to fall. It's going to accelerate towards the ground. Now, here's the ground. It's going to apply a normal force pushing up against the bag with the bolts. That is going to balance the force of gravity, meaning it's going to stop its motion, and that is going to return the bag to equilibrium. So this kind of tells you, in pictures, the order that your story should go, right? If we take this and now put it into note form, then from there, you could actually write the discussion section. So if we're going to first just start with stage 1, you've got rubber band holds the bag, which is empty, up against F of G, which pulls down. There's no motion, which tells you it's balanced and at equilibrium. So that would be stage 1, right? That pretty much sums up everything that happened in that first stage. So then we add a bolt, right? We start to add these black bolts into the bag here. So add a bolt, which leads to an increase of mass, which leads to an increase of force of gravity, which causes it to be unbalanced. And if it's unbalanced, that's going to cause the bag to accelerate, meaning move down. The rubber band, as a result of that, is going to stretch, apply greater upward force, and now F of RB is going to equal F of G, which means, that not that they're unbalanced, but that they are balanced again. And we can apply all that same vocabulary that we applied up here. That means there's no motion, they're balanced, they're at equilibrium, the net force is 0. Let's add that one here. Net force equals 0. Right? You can talk about all those things again. And then you can say even something as simple as, this will continue 25 more times. Right? There's no need to describe it 25 more times. You can just say this will continue 25 more times, or until rubber band breaks. And then in your last bullet point, you say if the rubber band breaks, that tells us that the F of G is once and for all greater than the F of the RB, right, because it broke the rubber band. The bag accelerates to the floor, which applies, move this up, a normal force, which means upwards, balancing gravity. So if gravity is once again balanced, we come back up to here. That means there'll be no motion. There's that at equilibrium, and the net force is back to 0, right? So you don't need 5 or 10 paragraphs to describe every single time this scenario or what's going to happen 25 times. But getting the story out, and this is the order that we want it. We don't want to necessarily talk about the rubber band breaking first, or talking about how the rubber band's moving before we even introduce the idea of the bolts being the mass. If we haven't talked about adding a bolt into the bag to increase the force of gravity, then there can't be any motion yet. So we do want to move in order because it's the order that makes sense, it's the order that the lab occurred in, and it's the order that causes motion. If you did want to talk about that kind of tug of war, that would fit in right here, right? That is where you could add in tug of war, talking about how the rubber band's stretching and it applying a greater upwards force. Now it's pulling upward, the gravity is pulling downwards, so that is, they're both forces, are pulling on that bag of bolts, just like in a game of tug of war where the two teams are pulling on the rope. So I hope this kind of went through the story a little bit, showed you what those sketches could look like, though yours would probably be, much more artistic than mine. But the whole point here is, in every single lab report where you're writing a full discussion section, you want the story, you want the essay portion, you want the discussion to flow. You want it to make sense, you want it to generally be in the same order that the lab occurred in. Not because the lab is doing anything special, but because that's going to make the most sense to your reader. We can't be talking about the bag moving if we haven't done what is necessary to cause that bag to move, meaning put the bolts in the bag. So that's why sketching it out kind of helps you visualize the different steps that are inherent to that story, and then actually take your notes and then write it up. Please refer back to this for studying for the midterm, and please let me know if you've got any questions.